Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. And those Anti-Federalists, they did. They absolutely got it right. And this is Tom Novolis, your host, and I am very, very, very delighted to be back with you. Here it is, 2020. We're charging into this new year with all sort of exciting things that are happening. Man, just what an exciting week this has been. Once again, I am not going to be charging down all of the standard pundit stuff, but there are a few things that I do want to talk about because I think they're absolutely relevant in regard to what is happening now, because as it is in the theme of this program, we talk about what is going on now and what are those mirrors in history. This week, we're going to start taking that additional dive down the road on what is political theology. And that is very interesting. You say, what? Political theology? Tom, what the heck are you even, where do you think you're going with that? Well, I think it's important because I was reading as I'm working on my next book related to Samuel Adams as the last Puritan, and what I put in the promos a couple weeks ago, I think, is the whole idea of, excuse me, what happened in a controversy within the churches there in New England back in 1764, and the political ramifications of all of that. What was that about? And included in the promo and on the archive page, I do have an article in there that comes from a religious historian, if you will, out of Massachusetts and the Harvard that talks about that. And it's an interesting article, but there's a greater reference to many other aspects of what was going on during that period and led up to controversies that were inclusive into why we had an American Revolution. So that'll be interesting as we get to that topic. I do have to say that when we think of the just war concept and what is going on around Iran, how do you deal with that? What does it mean from not just a Sam Adams perspective of what is war supposed to be and all about, but also I think was very critical to understand from George Washington's farewell address. I've mentioned to you before, and I'll mention it again, I think that Donald Trump has taken and at least had someone read to him, if he has not read or studied it himself, George Washington's farewell address. As you have heard from me over the years, I think that is some very great wisdom as to how our republic should function. So if you haven't read it, go back and take a look at George Washington's farewell address. And I will say that, once again, I believe that Donald Trump is following it as much as he can in relationship to the depth of the corrupt swamp that has happened over the last 60 years, maybe 80, closer to 100 years in America, with some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about as we move through in these various segments. A couple of other points that I wanted to bring out that are relative to arguments of the past are that on immigration, something that was very, very interesting to me that I saw here, I don't know if it was last week or a couple weeks ago, was the first article, was relative to the 17 Republican governors that are taking and wanting to bring in more refugees. 17 Republican governors wanting to bring in more refugees. And the question is why would they want to do that, especially if the majority of the refugees were going to be from Islamic type states? these are folks that do not assimilate well into our culture and environment and into what Americanism stands for. In fact, what they do is they take and they conclave in such a manner that they have no desire to take and become real Americans. They just want to transfer their country, their ideologies, and everything into our society as a republic and utilize then all of the benefits of Americanism and constitutionalism to actually destroy it. Now, the reason that a number of these governors gave, including the one here that my dad calls a Democrat, which is Mike DeWine in Ohio, is that they're afraid that the numbers are going down so that they're going to lose congressional seats over time. Well, wouldn't you think that if they got rid of the Democrats up in Cleveland and Cincinnati and even in Columbus, which is booming economically, quite honestly, and they revitalized those economies and the economies of other port cities along Lake Erie, like Ashtabula, that people would move back here. People would want to live and thrive and develop more of that economic base that would then include more people coming to Ohio because the jobs are here. Geez, that's why a lot of people are going to Texas and some other states, is because the economies are such, and that's what we're going to talk about in the second and third segments, is that we have given up the idea of liberty and morality for economy. And it's nothing new. It actually happened, back in the late 1600s and early 1700s. So we'll talk about that, because that's that historical look in that mirrors of history that, as I always say, coming out of Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. So we'll pay attention to that. And that what has happened is just this past week then, as a kind of cover their backsides, these several of the governors, the GOP or the Republican governors, are now backtracking in their statements as to why they want those refugees. Why is it that they're trying to bring them in? And the fact that right now the Trump administration is cutting that refugee admission into the country by 80%. So let's look at this. Statistically, it was saying that this would mean no more than 18,000 refugees will be resettled in the U.S. in this fiscal year, which started in October of 19 and will end September 30th of 2020. So based on that, why are these guys taking and scrambling, for refugees in? So there's a link to this article, or both articles, in for today's program. It went out in the promo, which is at samueladamsreturns.net, as well as the archives, which have it there also. Let's see if I can find what DeWine said. Here's the whiner. Had to reassure constituents with a statement after writing in a letter that he would continue to admit refugees into the state. DeWine said, "The state of Ohio has a long and successful history of welcoming and assimilating refugees from all corners of the globe. Though the state of Ohio is not involved in any assimilation process for resettled refugees." And that was outside the quote. So within the next 5 minutes, what I want you to think of, and this is what Sam Adams wrote to John Adams, as well as other founders, when they were talking about and arguing what would we do to bring in people into this country and allow them to settle, the biggest aspect of that was assimilation. So here we have the governor of Ohio falsely stating, let me be a little bit more stronger about that, lying, not telling the truth, that, oh, Ohio welcomes people and assimilates them, when in fact, there is no assimilation program in Ohio. And another fact, in Ohio, there are FBI watches and Department of Homeland Security watches on several of the mosques in Ohio because they are well known for their radicalism. So there's homework that you need to do all about that. All right, here's where we're going to go in the next two segments. In the next two segments, I want to take and draw us back just a tad on this idea of postmodern theology. And what does that mean for theological politics, or the politics of theology and theology political? As I mentioned in a last program, is this whole idea, or two programs ago, is this whole idea of a postmodernism and the threats that it is because there's no absolutes involved in it. And without having those absolutes involved in what it means to govern, what is right and what is wrong, is it okay to steal, is it okay to commit fraud, is it okay to sell drugs, is it okay for a lot of the immoral pressures that are put on society? Well, according to postmodernism, it's all fine. It's all honky-dory. It's all just fantastic. Do as you please. You know, it's all right in your own mind, whatever that mind may be. So what we have in this postmodern theology came about really in the 1980s. It came from some, again, out of the continent, out of Germany and that. And it is a real theological movement that has spread across the world. And we have seen that it has made the greater and larger impacts as we look at all of the various movements on the social justice warriors, what came out of the 1980s and how that has taken and transitioned and then has moved into all of the immoral politicalisms that have been occurring. So let's just think about the idea of theology. Theology is a study of religion in so many different ways. And those that are of a Christian perspective, look at that from the biblical God that is there, both from the Torah, the Old Testament, and that which came to us because of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. Interestingly, is that there is the theology of Marxism, there is the theology of sustainability, of environmentalism, of LGBTQism, of all of these other components that I spoke about in the newsletter intro, have their theological component. And what we're going to talk about in the next two segments is how those theological components, as we are seeing, become either codified or they become accepted bureaucratically because of court decisions. And then they become the precedent, which, as you know in my book, From Covenant to the Present Constitution, talks about how precedent is a bunch of malarkey, because most of it doesn't follow constitutionalism. And therefore, we end up with a lot of the immoral insanities that are causing kids to off themselves at young ages. It's all tied together. So as we take and we contemplate all that is there, and we look at how this postmodernism actually is a theology, Sam Adams, being the last Puritan, followed the theology of the Bible And so I want to talk about that some more when we come back in the next segment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists, they absolutely got it right. And as I've talked about so many different times, is that I am delighted to be here at Liberty Works Radio Network and at Soaring Eagle Radio. But what I'd like you to really take a look and do is look at the host and hostesses at Liberty Works Radio Network. And yes, please take the time to see what is happening during the week and enjoy that programming. But not just enjoy that programming. This is a listener-funded network. And yeah, that means you're the ones that fund the network. So please look for and find that donate button and click on that and participate to the level that you can. And those that go to Soaring Eagle Radio, you know what? Talk to those folks down there. They're really some pretty cool folks, and I'm so delighted to be on that network as well. We left off in the last segment with this idea of postmodernism, and in that, what is that theology? What does it drive to? What does that fit, and what does that mean from politics? How does that work from that political realm? Mentioned a little bit about what does it mean for immigration? What does it mean for bringing in immigrating refugees, assimilating them? Well, depending on your thought process, what do you believe, your belief system around that when you look at the entities that are involved in that, let me go back to that just for a second and try and go there, because that's one thing that I forgot to bring out and mention in the last article, was a lot of those entities that are looking at, oh gosh, we're going to bring these people in, and what does that mean for the state? Or wait a minute, some of the governors are saying, oh, wait, it's not my issue. It's because it's all the federal legislation and all of these immigration entities, these refugee resettlement folks, friends, patriots, follow the money. It's always about following the money. So here it is on these organizations, is that a lot of these resettlement organizations are tied to George Soros and others. But the worst part of it is, the worst part, whether you understand that or not, the worst part of it is that you, is that Sam, you look at the Uncle Sam thing, you have taken and are funding these refugee resettlement organizations from your federally funded budget. Now, right now, I think that budget is running right around $9 billion over a 5-year period. $9 billion taxpayer dollars are going to these resettlement organizations, okay? Or that's what it's costing us as taxpayers, is $9 billion. So let's see, here's who the major contractors are. And so if you see these come up on, wanting donations, what you need to do is run away from them, or what you need to do is challenge them on what they're doing. And they're going to argue with you. But anyway, the organizations are the Church World Service, the Ethiopian Community Development Council, the Episcopal Migration Ministries, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, International Rescue Committee, U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and the World Relief Corporation. You're funding these organizations with significant amount of tax dollars. And the hard part is that all these folks that get resettled, they get free money, they get free stuff, and then they're supposed to get jobs, they're supposed to become parts of society, and then after that first year period of time, they become eligible for all the social programs out there: housing, food, education, you name it. So that's why it's costing us that $9 billion over a 5-year period of time. That's something that the Anti-Federalists warned about. They argued about, even during the Constitutional Convention on Immigration, is that if you assimilate people, and we have to go back to my grandparents who came from Europe and had to assimilate, had to learn English, had to get jobs, had to be sponsored properly by family members, not by resettlement organizations. Anyway, enough on that one for now. Let's get back to this idea of what I was talking about relative to political theology. You know, we hear everybody running around on separation of church and state. We try and wonder and understand, what does that mean? We look at what I have in there on what's become institutionalized on social justice, cultural Marxism, socialism, climate change, immorality, non-biological compatible marriage. That's my way of talking about, the sodomites marrying and all of that. Abortion and infanticide. These we're going to go through, and not saying that the series is going to be every week because you get bored with me on that, but the fact is that I'm going to come back and keep revisiting this. And the real tie-in and the questions that I asked you to consider: did the challenges of controversial theological positions foster the call to arms by the revolutionary founders of the United States? Some people argue yes. Those people that argue yes to some extent on that was John Adams in particular, which was interesting because he became a Unitarian, which had major theological differences as we consider what was going on within the history, and that's why I put in the references, history about the Congregational Church and what happened with the Puritans and how that all changed even during that period of time. And the answer from his perspective was yes, because what was going on, and Sam Adams wrote about it in several articles in the newspaper during that period in 1764, was that the Church of England was trying to then, and England itself, impose bishops upon the colonies. They were trying to do it for two different reasons, and especially in the northern colonies, because of the fact and reality that the Congregationalists had very close ties within the context of the political system, not only within what that meant for how the church governance operated, but that if you were not a member of the church, you couldn't vote. You couldn't vote. And that made a very strong political statement as to what the laws were, how did that function, how was society to function. And that followed all the way back from the Puritans coming to America and looking at that idea of a biblical perspective of how society can function when they function under the guidelines and the rules of God. What did that mean? What was happening around that? Were there things that happened negatively? Well, there were. There was a lot that happened in a negative form, but there was a lot that happened in a positive form as well. But when we started looking at, did that facilitate the revolution all unto itself? The answer is no, because of all the economic aspects of what began to happen also, and all of the other taxation and rules and regulations. But in New England in particular, because of how the congregational church in particular functioned and operated, taking and bringing in bishops from the Anglican Church was a slap in the face, not only of the northern colonies and what was happening up there, but also was an imposition on the middle colonies and the southern colonies that operated in Presbyterianism. That was like, no, we're not going to let this happen, because the real threat would have then been that the state religion of Anglicanism under the Church of England would be more strongly imposed upon all of the various colonies. So then it gets to, did Sam Adams have anything to say about it? Yeah, he wrote some different articles. And what is the simple definition of religion and associated theology? I spoke about that a little bit in the first segment, is that any time that somebody's belief system becomes so strong, and that what it then has to have are arbiters and arguers to take and qualify that system and to take and pressure that system into the rest of society. So that's why I say that we have the political theologies of all of the isms, of all of the immoralities, of all of the other points that I opened this or brought forth in this segment and that are referenced back in the archives at samueladamsreturns.net. Their spokesmen are their theologians. And in fact, then what happens, as it happened, and we'll talk about in the third segment, as what happened is that the political changes, the societal changes occur by what becomes law. It happened back in 1707. It was happening back in the 1640s and 1680s as changes were happening within the context of the churches, even the congregational church, as you go through and look at the history of what changes were happening within their internal theological discussions, and even how internal church politics were occurring, and what did that mean as it pushed forward then into the political environment of the community. So we're seeing some of that change happening now. We've seen it over decades in a lot of the other denominations out there. But the one that's experiencing it at the moment and is in the front of the news is the Methodist Church. And the split that's happening within the Methodist Church right now between that component that is pro-LGBT, homosexual marriage, and so on and so forth, and those that would hold to the orthodoxy of biblical truth, of Wesleyan biblical preaching. Now, that's a significant thing that's happening. Stuff is happening like that in the Baptists. Stuff has happened like that in the liberal Presbyterianism. It has absolutely happened generations ago within the congregational churches, who became, in so many places, Unitarians, which is a big theological shift. What that means is that they don't believe in the Trinity. They believe that there's only this one God, kind of like the Muslims do. And there's all these other then religions that developed out of or around that similar concept. So they all have their theologians. Everyone has a political transition that happens and an emphasis that then moves into the general society of politics. And then when we go back and we look at this postmodern theology, you start mixing that all together into the big cauldron of, wow, how does that fit into constitutionalism? Boy, we have some things to look at. There's definite answers to what is going on today that are no different than what happened at the time of Samuel Adams. Come on back in the next segment as we take a little bit other direction and dive. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists, they did. They absolutely got it right, especially those that had the same thought process as Samuel Adams. And by the way, this is Tom Navolis, your host. I don't know that I've ever introduced myself in any of the other segments. Kathy just put and said once. Okay, so now you know who I am if you didn't know who I was, and I'm so delighted that you're here. And, you know, as I say over and over again, the arguments of the Anti-Federalists exceed the arguments of the Federalists, and their perspective was, what was it? I know that many of you who've listened to this program know it, but it is, from my perspective and definition, that the Federalists expected that the churches would do their job and the pulpits would always ensure that we had a virtuous and moral people, so that the Constitution of the United States would be that active covenant by which a moral people could make decisions, and that the states, as their own republics, would take and be able to morally work and guide the people for the overall benefit of everyone. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, said, no. That's a good thought. That's a good idea. But if you read your history, and they were telling them to read their history at that period of time, it goes back to the simple biblical perspective. And this is the original Reformation biblical perspective. Man is sinful. So are the leaders. And for the most part, the pulpits aren't going to necessarily do their job. And that argument was holding true even in the late 1680s, 1640s. We can go back as early as that. And then as we started to see in that 1680s, 1690s, that the economy in the colonies was starting to come unraveled in so many different ways. Not only that, was that the fact of the matter is that what was happening from the congregational churches themselves and the ideas, and especially in the northern colonies, the whole idea of Christianity being predominant to the extent that it was, and humankind in the colonies being more of that church religious Christian bent, was falling off. No different today. You know, I brought you different segments. I brought you different statistics from the Pew Reports and that, on how much Christianity has dropped off and how much we're seeing a number of the ideas of morality just going into the hell pit, if you will. And the changes that were then being put on as pressure points from those society, the people that were going, wow, you know what? We need to be competitive economically. So we started to see in that late 1600s that the desire for economy was starting to outstrip the idea of what it meant of maintaining one's soul, what it meant to maintain one's continuity and understanding of God, what it meant for morality, what it meant for service to the community. So there were changes that started happening. As we know, and we've talked about from a historical point of view, is that we had Harvard being one of the first universities that started, especially in the northern colonies, was there to produce ministers and would be the Reformation-minded Puritan idea of ministers, within now the concept of the congregationalism as a form of church governance. That's what Harvard was really established for. But when we started seeing in those later periods, from the historical perspective, economy started to matter more. Economy, over everything else in life, started to matter more. And we had even a minister and his brother, as well as a couple other ministers that go, well, wait a minute, let's take another step here. And in 1707, they replaced the president of Harvard with a layperson. John Leverett was made the president of Harvard, replacing Pastor Increase Mathers. Hence, Harvard began its drift from a strong theological established college to what we see today. I called it, in the promo, I called it the tsunami of contrarian moral leadership. And what began to change there then was more of the political tide, is that instead of having, as the Reformation understood, as we saw in larger Reformation truth around how should man lead. And if we look at the Old Testament examples of how society would function in a republic that was established under the guidelines of who the ultimate authority would be, folks, we have what we have today. We have the postmodern democrats who have the theological politics of Marxism, socialism, LGBTQ, of abortion, of euthanasia, of everything that I mentioned in the first couple segments and the opening paragraph of the promo for this program. The theological politics started shifting in the late 1600s. They shifted even more strongly in 1707 when a lay person, a merchant, became the president of Harvard. And then Harvard started moving away from a strong biblical theological base to the place of where it is now, that Harvard Theological Seminary is there to produce Unitarian preachers and Unitarian theology. And that Unitarian theology is there to talk about ethics. But the way that it's talking about ethics is that there's no absolutes from a biblical perspective, so anything goes. And you can move and maneuver your theology according to your own discretion. We see that. We see that over and over in so much of what has happened in American culture. We see it in what's happened in much of the major American denominations. Any denomination that goes for climate change, any denomination that goes for social justice, any denomination that goes for all of what I brought forward in that opening paragraph and more, has taken and in so many ways perverted the ideas of fundamental constitutionalism and has created new theological politics. We see it by the laws that are being passed locally in your community. We see it in the laws that are being passed and the ordinance being passed in your county. Hey, you know what? Anybody can use any bathroom. You know what? It doesn't matter. Oh, school boards. You know what? Today, if you want to be a girl, Okay, young man, be a girl. Hey, girl, if you want to be a boy, okay, I guess you're a boy. Tomorrow, oh, you changed your mind? Oh, okay, that's okay. So even the idea of who uses what bathroom, I have to say that when I take a look at the mental ills within the young people today, and there is an article here that where the medical associations in particular are taking and they are allowing for medical societies provide cover for the transgender industry propaganda. I think I brought this up to you before, but there's a lot of money in transgender insanity, and that's what it is, because it goes so contrary to God's design for this world, God's design for how we should function as societies of people within even our political realm. So does it matter? Does it really, really matter what theology is? Does it really matter how we take and we look at what's going on in the various denominations that are out there? The Methodists, as I brought up in the last segment, are dividing right now and going to divide, no different than the Congregationalists divided back in the 1680s and 1690s, and then even more so in the 1700s into Unitarianism versus Congregationalism versus orthodoxy versus liberalism. And they even used that back then was, this Christian idea of liberalism that stepped away from the foundational biblical truths. So I guess if you want to chase and be your own God, but have some kind of religious idea, and then substantiate the laws, the ordinances, the rules for schools, if you will, according to your own thought processes, because that's what makes you feel good, that justifies what is going on in your brain, in your mind, as far as how the world should be. If that's what you're doing, and if that's what's out there, and the people that are out there doing that, then they're trying to be God. My dad always says it's like the sons of Satan, is what he calls those that are of their own mind in that manner. Because this is what the AntiFederalists talked about. This is what Sam Adams talked about. And as you'll see in my next book, is that he definitely understood the foundational principles of Reformation biblical truth. And in doing that, that means that there is a sovereign, and that being the sovereign God of the Bible, who in fact has taken and created the world in such a manner that he looks at it, and at a point in time he said, I need to do something about it. He destroyed it once under Noah, but he brought a salvation to it under Jesus. Yeah, I'm a Calvinist, so there's a whole bunch of stuff around that I'm not going to take you down the path on, but I will take you down this path on theological politics, and that you can have a theological politics that is immoral. And we're seeing that. We're seeing it, professed every day, especially within the Democrat Party. And you go and you look at all of those people that are promoting it. Is it really for liberty? Where is economy? Is economy really for liberty? Well, first off, the only liberty that you're going to be able to begin with is a liberty in Christ, because he makes us all free. And then he gives us that right connection as to who is the sovereign of the universe and how we then take and have our theology correct so we can have our politics and our personal lives and in our family correct. And then we can take and we can transcend that into every aspect of life. And that's what the Anti-Federalists understood. And that's what they were saying as we take a hard look at Samuel Adams, because he's returned and those Anti-Federalists got it right. See you next week.